Hey everyone! Decided to get back to one of the reasons I made my channel, to talk about our folklore and history. If you listen to Irish folklore, you may have heard of the Féar Gorta, meaning famine man, or the Féar Gorta, that is the hungry or famine grass. The famine man is a skeletal being that signals death and appears in human form. Féar Gorta is a folklore tale of a cursed patch of land where if you step, you are doomed to die of starvation, no matter how much you eat. The hungry man and hungry grass have two origins, but the awful outcome facing either is very much the same. I have to tell you about the Irish famine and talk about the history before I can tell you about the Féar Gorta, or the hungry grass. They both originate from the most dreadful and darkest times in our Irish history. Like many folklore tales that are steeped in history, where truth and myths get entwined with the telling of the story. It has many names: the Irish Great Hunger, the Great Famine, the Irish Potato Famine. Whatever you choose to call it, there is no way it can describe the despair, death and absolute devastating effects on our country and what our ancestors had to endure. Religious and class discrimination, slave labour, starvation and forced exile in cold and never-ending winters. Penal laws under British rule meant that parliamentary officials were mainly British and their male descendants who had been granted landed estates in Ireland. Catholics previously had their land confiscated and now had to settle for leasing their own land back from the now British landowners. The potato was only brought to Ireland in the 18th century, but soon became a staple due to being hardy and surviving our weather. It was cheap and went far to feed many a hungry mouth. Potatoes became infested with an airborne fungus known as potato blight. It is believed the fungus was carried by the wind across the Irish Sea and began destroying our Irish crops. Corn laws which existed had a high tariff to protect British corn prices. This, with the continued exploitation by British landowners and merchants, meant a food shortage. It brought Ireland and its people to its very knees. When things were thought to be at its very worst, Charles Trevelyan was brought in to assist with the relief, but turned out to be one of the most hated men in Irish history. Trevelyan was a civil servant with no compassion or empathy to the Irish people he was asked to assist. His plans to create employment and restart the economy were long and complicated and turned out to be a complete failure. The government believed this blight would be short-lived, but they couldn't have been more wrong. British Prime Minister at the time, Robert Peel, had been supplying Ireland with corn imports, but when he left office in 1846, Trevelyan took complete control and cut off Ireland from receiving any further help, even though his plan to create a working economy had failed drastically. Instead of sending food, Trevelyan sent soldiers to try and instill order. When one of the most brutal winters hit Ireland, he forced 500,000 out to build roads. Men, women and children, barely clothed and starving, many would drop dead where they stood. 1847 would become known as Black 47, the worst year of the Great Hunger. The population was starving and worked for hardly any wages or food. Disease ravaged Ireland, and most dying from this rather than malnutrition. Finally, all Trevelyan's projects were shut down, and soup kitchens and charities were introduced, but it was all too slow and too late. 1847 saw the third potato harvest failure. As time passed, landowners wanted their land back to farm. The tenants couldn't grow their own crop, couldn't work, and hadn't paid rent in years. As if starvation and disease wasn't enough, they were now being evicted from their homes. Over 500,000 were evicted, with a further 100,000 been forced to emigrate to North America with false promises of a better life. Their transport would become known as the Coffin ships. The so-called Coffin ships were barely seaworthy, packed with starved families ravaged by disease. The first Coffin ship headed to Quebec, Canada. The 3,000-mile journey, depending on winds, would take from 40 days to 3 months. In the spring of 1847, shipload after shipload of fevered Irish arrived, promised by landlords back home that an agent would greet them. They knew the Irish would never ever make it back to Ireland to put a claim in on their land. They were instead put in quarantine on board the ships, and the bodies were thrown into the sea. Others, half alive, were dumped on Gross Island and crawled on their hands and knees to the makeshift fever hospitals. Many died on the roadside. They were not welcomed by the mainly Puritan communities of Canada and North America. Back in Ireland, Trevelyan fought to save his career by blaming the Irish landowners for the years of horror inflicted on the Irish people. Ireland was left in financial ruin. The Poor Law, which had been introduced, forced landowners over a quarter of an acre to sign over any assets to receive aid. Workhouses were cramped full with widows and children, and if Trevelyan had had his way, they would have been thrown out onto the streets to make room for those fit to work. Families were forced to camp anywhere in the harsh cold winters. I've included some photographs of a workhouse in County Antrim. When I found out it was actually the graveyard of the workhouse, we didn't go anymore. It now always fills me with sadness of the desperate and starved people laid there in their final resting place. I will be doing a deeper dive into our workhouses and poorhouses in the future. Soon the workhouses were even full and riddled with debt, and British government refused to fund them any longer due to non-payment of taxes. Instead of sending help, the government sent soldiers to control the situation. There was whispers of rebellion, and the government threatened exile to Botany Bay and internment. Ireland was a ghost nation. Cottages abandoned, families gone, fields empty. The workhouses were rife with disease, people living in filth, the violent and mentally ill all threw in together with families and infants. Food was minimal at best. The hope gone from their sunken eyes and rags for the clothes. Death was common, and the ravaged bodies were thrown onto carts and tipped into mass graves. These poor souls never even received a blessing, their souls condemned to purgatory. All over Ireland, these mass graves appeared on our famine graveyards. In later years, many became memorialised and consecrated ground. Some, however, remained buried in cold, unhallowed ground, forgotten souls crying out for their purgatory to end. Over the top of these burial sites, the grass grew sparsely, and it was cursed. It was hungry. With the horror of the famine, it is no surprise to hear tales born from it. The Féar Gorta is one of the most feared fairies in Irish folklore. Hunger follows in his footsteps. He is a lone, gaunt, emaciated figure. As I've said before, he is not to be confused with Féar Gorta or the hungry grass, which is related but separate. It is a patch of land covered in sparse grass, where whoever is to step on it would starve to death, no matter how much they ate. They could fill their bellies time and time again, but to no avail, eventually starving to death. Some say the Féar Gorta would rise up when sacred plots of land were disrespected. This would probably be one of the reasons I stopped walking Jasper on the one at the workhouse. Keeping a crust of bread in your pocket or sprinkling crumbs over the patch of grass was thought to protect you, and even burning the field would see it off for good. Alas, there is no such protection from the hungry man. If he came to your door, you would be best to feed him, and you'll definitely know him by the greenish hue to his emaciated body. He'll have his empty begging bowl and be dressed in rags. Although he is much feared, if he was fed, he could be generous, but woe betide anyone who mocked him, for he retaliated without mercy, cursing bad luck and hunger to the end of their days. He has made kings into paupers and paupers into princes. He will always be a reminder of the famine, the disaster and despair on our ancestors. Now remember to always carry a crust of bread, friends, in your pocket, and you'll be grand. I'll end it there, and I'll see you next time for some more Irish folklore.
Yeah.